The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Welcome to Colonie TV. I'm Evelyn Neale, Director of the William K. Sanford Town Library, and today we have with us Rosemary Armao. She's the Director of Journalism at U Albany, she's the President of the Library Board, and she's a native to Colonie. And we are going to talk about Wild West Albany. Welcome, Rosemary.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. I love this topic, and I'll talk your ear off if you don't stop me.
Excellent. Well, as you know, I'm new to the Colonie area.
Right.
What does Wild West Albany mean?
Well, Wild West Albany refers to a section of Colonie, which you are in right now, of course, and it's right on the border, the northern border of Albany, and it's a hamlet. You probably have been through it if you're on your way to Albany. When you cross over the Waterville Avenue extension, you see a long, big, tall chimney stack on the right-hand side. That's the remnant of the Tobin packing plant, a slaughterhouse. Closed in 1981, but it was one of the major institutions of West Albany, which was an immigrant community for many, many decades. At least 5 generations of my family are from there.
Wow.
And it's sort of a shadow of its former self right now. It has decayed over the years. It's not like it was. So some of the things I hope to be describing this afternoon are not things that you'll really see anymore. They live on in our memories. But it was a great place, and many people still speak warmly about it and have long-lasting memories of it.
And how did you get interested in the topic?
My great-grandfather, Anthony Scaringe, came from Morro Locarno, which is a mountain town, very poor, in the mountains right outside of Naples. And he came over and was one of the first settlers of the area. He came with many friends, who then became the start of families that settled in West Albany. They came here because of the railroad. Starting around the Civil War time, railroads became very large in this part of the country. New York Central suddenly had thousands of jobs open, which paid good money to men who had no skills to offer. They had big backs, they had broad shoulders, lots of brawn, but they weren't schooled, no special skills. So it was a natural that people from parts of throughout Eastern and in these parts, Southern Europe came to the United States. So many of my ancestors settled here. We have a long history. As I say, my great-grandfather raised a family there of 12 children. Oh. My grandmother and my grandfather lived their entire lives there. My mother did as well. She married a boy from Troy, Italian, of course. And they moved outside, but only less than a mile from West Albany. So, and of course, I grew up in this area. So I'm a journalist, as you mentioned. I've traveled all over the world looking for great stories. And suddenly, when I came back home, which was in 2008, after years of living away, I came back to live with my mother, and I discovered this story right in my own backyard. It was there, not only so close to me, but part of me, and I had been blind to it until then. After it's mostly all gone away, I began collecting the stories from the place, and I continue to do that now. I've written a couple of papers about it, and I've made presentations, and whenever I do that, I hear from people saying, "You don't have the whole story. You left this out." And they're right. There's generations grew there and have their roots there and still long for it. So that's, as you can tell, I'm really pretty passionate about it.
That's excellent. So always our best stories are right in our backyard.
It's
right?
really true. It's really true.
So tell us a little bit about everyday life in the village during its heyday.
It's a very small place. It basically is 3 big roads, starting with Exchange Street and then the connecting roads that hook them up. Very small. And yet, in that area, there was everything that you needed for a full life. So people were pretty isolated. I said we moved at one point less than a mile from West Albany, and we might as well have fallen off the edge of the earth where the wolves are on the maps because it seemed so far away.
Yeah.
It was very, very self-contained. There were stores and bars and great places to play with. There were the major institutions were work and church and the Italian Benevolent Society, a social club and self-help organization. And they were isolated in a way by their nationality. Italians were much discriminated against, of course, in our country at the time. But there had been successions of immigrants before that. My great uncle used to boast about how they had pushed the Irish out, Irish as they called them. He had pushed them out, and the Italians had moved in.
Right.
So it was very self-contained, extremely hardworking. You are not, as we're seeing with refugees from Syria now, these are not people unwilling to work and to work hard. The Italians loved their families. They wanted nothing more than to raise their children. So they worked very hard. You'll hear stories of the women on a Sunday morning being up and making braciole, which is a very labor-intensive meat recipe beloved by all of us who are Italian.
Yeah.
And they would be doing that before they would go to church, or they would be out in the garden weeding and picking and taking care of it before they'd go in and dress and go to church on a Sunday morning. The men had unbelievably difficult jobs. The railroad was one. Tobin packing, working in a slaughterhouse, was also extremely difficult work. So they were tired. They would come home, they were worn out and dirty, and they would play very hard. So there were more bars. I still don't know if I have the exact number in this very small neighborhood. I don't know if I have the exact number down. But these were wild places. Card games would go on, definitely lots of drinking, and gambling was huge. Gambling was fun, and everybody was in on it too. It was very open. And because of the discrimination, police came in a lot too. They would come in and check out things.
Of course.
So that's a little bit about it. All the workers were men. It was very traditional too. Women stayed at home and took care of kids, and there were a lot of kids. They're Italians,
right?
Believe in big families. So my great-grandfather had 12 children. That was pretty normal. And you'll be surprised. I still can't fathom it when you look at the places even now that remain. These are tiny houses. And I have a huge house and 3 kids, and it feels crowded sometimes. How did they do that? And of course, bathrooms for much of the time I'm talking about would be in the backyard.
It would be outhouses.
So and every bit of work was manual and took a long time. So to feed 12 children, I mean, you didn't go to the supermarket and buy ready-made food. You were plucking the feathers out of chickens to feed them, and washing clothes was an entire day's enterprise because you'd push them through a wringer.
Right.
I'm mixing up some time periods here,
Sure.
but through all of this time, it was very difficult, lots of work. And I also think about what it must have smelt and sounded like. The sound of train whistles and trains rolling through. People talk about their relatives coming to visit from New York City, which was, of course, the big city even then. But they would come here and not be able to sleep in West Albany because the trains would
so
keep going
loud.
through.
Oh, that's funny. It would be the other way around now.
Yes, we didn't even hear them, of course.
Right.
And then there would be whistles blowing all day long because these were industrial places. So the whistle would blow. The shifts would be called. So that regulated life.
Right.
And then there's the fact that you are living not close to, right next to a slaughterhouse that they brought in, hundreds, thousands of animals every day. They came in by railroad and by truck and were put into this 5-story huge building and killed, and waste was produced. The smell was unbelievable. If you talk to anybody about West Albany, you are going to hear about the smell. And some will say, oh my God, I never got used to it. And most people say something kind of nostalgic, like to us, that was the smell of security. We knew Dad had a job when we smelled that. But it was quite monstrous. I remember it very well.
Now, you said the slaughterhouse was open until 1981?
It was. It opened in 1924 is when it officially became Tobin's, and it was fortuitous because by this time New York Central was closing down operations in this area. West Albany at one point had been one of the largest stockyards in the country, like right after Chicago, and a few other big ones. But it was right in it was major, and that is how Tobin's moved in, of course, because the animals were coming in. But by the 1920s even, and then it increasingly went on, the railroad jobs went away. And by 1984, they were all gone. But Tobin took up the slack. And it became a major producer of meat in this area. And it employed 3 shifts of men, hundreds. Even at the time it closed, not the best times, there were still 600 people working there.
Wow.
So double that during the other time.
Wow.
Anybody who needed work could find it at Tobin, which is a remarkable thing. This was long before the time of civil rights, and yet black people worked there, right next to white people. No difference, and that was because we needed workers, and if you were willing to do the work, you got a job. Italians are not especially known for tolerance, so I've always found that really interesting, that the blacks who worked there from Albany, they would come up from Albany, and they made very good money, and at one point there was a movement by the company not to pay someone who was doing work equal to the others the same, and his fellow workers stood up for him.
Wow.
So it wasn't just kind of get along. It was seems really
real.
genuine.
Yeah.
Tobin was completely a part of this community. That's the way that many factories might have been at the turn of the century. We don't have that now.
Right.
I've heard Beechnut up in Canandaigua was much the same. They sponsored sports teams. They had picnics every year. They gave out lots of stuff. Some people still have their pencils that say Tobin, or other gifts like that. They would have clam bakes every year. When you retired, you got a gold watch and a party. I have pictures of these events. When you died, when someone in your family died, they would send a ham to the wake to participate. So it was. I just can't describe to you, because we don't have anything comparable to it now, how much this packing plant was part of the community, which is why things like the stench was forgiven.
Yeah.
My favorite story is on the Seifert family. Now, they lived right directly across. You literally crossed a very narrow street, Exchange Street, and you were at the plant. So the girls in the family were never allowed to go off of the porch at certain times of the day when the shift changed. They would have been run over by cars. And they could never have a swimming pool, a little inflatable swimming pool like we all had in the 50s and 60s, because it would have just been covered in soot from the plant. And the smell was just unbelievable, of course, there. Yet, one day, after the girls had moved away and their parents were at home, they went to bed one night and apparently left a cigarette in not in the right place, inappropriate place. And when the night shift came out, they saw smoke coming out of the window. And they are the ones who called the fire department. They're the ones who came and pulled the family out. So the Seifert girls credit Tobin Packing Company with saving their parents' life. That's not a connection with a packing plant that most of us have. We'd be outraged at the idea of living that close.
Wow.
Tobin it's an amazing place. The work that they did was so strenuous when you hear about it. They would deal with hundreds, not a small ship, hundreds of these wild, because they can smell death, they know what's coming.
Sure.
Hogs that weighed almost 400 pounds.
Wow.
Some of them weighed more than that. And it was all physical labor. You had to grab these and stick them with things that would hurt or kill them, and then put them on a ramp that would carry them on a conveyor belt up. And I spoke to men who did this. Unbelievably difficult work. And they have arthritis.
Sure.
It's very dangerous work. You're around wild animals, basically, with knives. Okay? It doesn't get more dangerous than that.
No, definitely not.
And the jobs were gross, My uncle, Anthony Stellato, spent he started, that was his first job at the age of 19. He worked there until the plant closed down. And he tells a great story about when he was there for the first day. And they told him that his job would be to clean out the drains that ran through the kiln floor. And this is totally gross, but when you slaughter hogs, there are tapeworms in the intestine, and these, of course, are not part of the food process, so they'd be thrown out and they would end up in these drains. So you'd have to reach in, if you can imagine this, and you'd have,
Yeah.
So that was his reaction at first, And he said by the end of a week, he would be doing that with one hand, eating a sandwich for lunch with the other. You just got used to it.
Wow.
Yeah, because you knew always that you were a man. You were doing work for your family.
Right.
But I mentioned how I say that you were a man. Women were allowed to work there. Unusual at the time. There were even women on the killing floor, which are the hardest, most difficult jobs. If you could do the work, you could do it. And if you were a widow who had children to raise, well, then you got a job cooking in the kitchen. They gave you something to peeling the garlic. One widow had a job.
So if you were a
doing
single
that.
woman, they would be put somewhere else.
A single woman raising children. Yeah, you could look for something. Kids who were trying to raise money for college or for school would work summer jobs there. It was also a place that men brought their kids to work so that they would want to go to college, because you won't have to do the work I did.
Yes, yes.
So it's and deaf people work there. Handicapped people at this time did not get jobs easily, and these were very high-paying jobs too. So I don't know.
So it's a real important part of our community.
Hugely important, yeah.
So you titled this "The Wild West Albany." Why is that?
Well, I've been speaking so lovingly about it. Everyone cared for each other, but it was a wild town too. That name fits. My uncle used to tell a story about the bus that would stop right on the edge of West Albany. On this side would be the Italian West Albany, and this side would be the Irish, other part,
right.
The real world. And the Italians would call them the Mitigons. That was in their dialect. That was the Americans. And he would say that they would get off on the bus and they'd see all these very dark men, long curls, smoking probably, heavy clothes, standing around in street corners, and they would run the other way towards their safe side of the line. And to us, of course, it was just, it was our uncles and it was our grandfathers, and these were people that we knew and loved. So it looked dangerous. If you spent any time in the village, you would see that everyone had a nickname, and there are wonderful. I'm collecting the nicknames. There was Fatty and Donuts and Hot Dog and Meatballs, and it's just amazing. Everyone had a nickname, unless, like one of my great uncles, you inoculated your kids and gave them names that could not be turned into nicknames. But his, for example, was Nunzio. That's hard to Nuns. He became.
Yeah.
So the people were colorful too. They were very wild. But there were some actual crimes there. In fact, the first woman ever executed, put in the electric chair in New York State, was a woman, a 28-year-old woman from West Albany. Her name was Anna Antonio. She was 28 years old, and the press called her Little Anna because she was really tiny. I think she lost a lot of weight in prison, actually, but she was like 85 pounds, long, dark, thick hair. And she was accused of hiring two men to kill her husband. Her husband, Salvador. The story was she was a battered woman. That possibly is true.
Yeah.
But he was not much liked. He was a brakeman on the railroad. Part of the story is that he was running dope and dealing with guns, and he was just a generally bad guy. So she hires two guys to kill him and offers part of his insurance for the payment. And these two men did. They stabbed and shot him, but it was like multiple times, 5 times shot and 15 times wounded, and they stabbed. I mean.
Yeah.
And they find him by the side of the road, and she is arrested, as are they. They spill their guts.
Right.
And she was executed, and so were they. They were all put to death. And the governor, after that, got many complaints about not treating a woman differently. How could you do that? And he was all very sanctimonious about treating all criminals the same, regardless of gender. So there was that murder. There was a little bit later in 1928. There was a really bizarre case. To raise money, to make extra money, women, I say, can't work outside the home. But what they could do was rent out an extra room in their house. Where the extra room came from when they had, 8, 9, 10 children, I have no idea. It must have been very small. But they would rent out a room. And Mrs. DeZorbo did that. She rented out a room. And that boarder turned up dead. one night after what was reported to be a loud fight in Malucci's Grill. And her husband, Michael DeZorbo, was never seen in West Albany again. So her grandchildren are forbidden to talk about it. To this day, we still don't have all the details on it.
Wow.
But did Michael DeZorbo kill the boarder because he was jealous? Which would definitely be a trait of Italian immigrants. That sounds familiar. Hot temper, and that happened. So there was that. There were other lesser crimes, of course.
Right.
A great uncle of mine was involved in a carjacking because kids were running around, and the cars were unusual and fun, and so a joyride turned into a auto theft, and he spent time in a reformatory. But there were other things that made it wild too. I mean, just the nature of this work was so outlandish. Women knew the name of the doctor who treated the plant. They were used. If you got a call from Dr. So and so, you knew what was up, and that could happen at any time. And kids ran just crazy in the neighborhood. This, of course, is in the time we don't let our kids loose now.
Right.
Put them in organized play groups in the library.
Yes.
They didn't have story time in those days. And so the kids would be running around a slaughterhouse. They would be running up the ramps where they would run the hogs. Well, kids would play there, too.
Wow.
Or there was a produce factory right in the middle of the factory, and the kids would love to go in the back where they could eat the rotten watermelons. And there was a conveyor belt there that would load up produce to bring into the building, and the kids would jump on that and try to ride it a little bit. My one cousin has a 2-inch scar on his knee from an encounter with that conveyor belt. They would tie giant swings, a giant rope with a tire or something around an oak branch, and then swing as far as they could until the branch broke. Not really good for bones.
No.
So the kids were kind of crazy too. That made it wild. It was and gambling. We have to talk about the gambling in West Albany. Card games are my family still. That's the main entertainment. And I always loved that men who had no schooling, they could not pass any of the tests of Common Core at all, whether if they chose to took them, but yet they could compute the odds for craps in their head. And so there were crap games every night, outside of Malucci's, and they were regularly raided by the state police. And one of my favorite stories on that was Frank Ballone was his name, and he was among one of the men one day. Trooper said, "Okay, get up here, line up, put down your money, put down your craps, tell us your names." And he goes, "Joe Baloney," because, as I said, everybody had nicknames.
Right. But
the cops, of course, thought he was just being smarty pants, and he got slapped for that. He was hit in the head for that. The gambling was something that I've said, is this like drug dealers now use children, and in a way it was just part of life. So.
Yep.
Kids would frequently be saying, "Hey, how about I'll give you some licorice if you run this bag from up to Rosie's Grill," and it would be a little brown paper bag. They had no idea what it was. Well, it was numbers. They were running numbers in the receipts back and forth. Very common, and not seen as something sinful or bad by a population that when they weren't in Tobin Packing Plant, they were in St. Francis de Sales Catholic Church. This was a very religious, pious place.
Sure.
So
it's just part of their experience.
Yeah, it was the way like I said, they worked really hard.
Right.
And so your entertainment was incredibly important to you too.
Yeah. Was it considered a ghetto, or because it was a poor area? Or?
That's a really interesting question. They certainly would never have portrayed themselves that way.
Sure.
They're incredibly proud. They still are. In making one of these presentations, I described the area as run down now. And I heard from people who live there saying, "What do you mean? Come and see this. Come look at this." So they're still very proud of the area.
Yeah.
But they did not have a lot of money. They were dirt poor when they came here. Definitely there was prejudice and segregation at the time. The Italians, go there.
Sure.
You could live there. So I think probably we would call it that, but they certainly never saw it that way.
Yeah.
Poverty is, even now we know the way you perceive that is how you see the people around you. There were, for many years, there was not TV. You didn't see a different way of life. They lived so much within themselves. It's not like they went to school and saw Well, they did see the Mitigons who went to West Albany too, but the difference would be their lunches would be a thick Italian bread with fried peppers and greasy meat and kind of dripping over the sides. And the kids would long for peanut butter and jelly like the American kids. But, that's not the same as saying, oh, I wish I had it like you.
Right.
So,
right.
no, I don't.
Not the same as what we would consider a ghetto.
No.
In any way, I don't think. Other institutions beside the workplace?
Yeah, I mentioned St. Francis de Sales Church. We all had this common experience. If you were born there, or if you knew somebody who, like I did, my grandmother lived right in there. We actually were outside, but we went to church there every Sunday. So you had your communion there, you had your confirmation there. Generations of people have scrapbooks in which there's a picture of them in front of the Blessed Virgin Mary that's outside the church. It was a core to the people's lives, and nothing more so than in July of every year there was the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, who was the patron saint of the area. And this started as a community event when my mother was a girl. She's 90 now. And people would string lights across the street, and the women would all cook huge amounts of meatballs and anything else, sausage and peppers. And they would sell this out in the street, or they would have booths in front of their homes and sell this. That turned into a community celebration when the church teamed with the Italian Benevolent Society. And it was a 3-day event, second only to Christmas in our lives. And there would be the march through the streets. We would wear our first communion dresses and carry white gladiolas, and we would march up and down the streets of the village with a little band playing in front. And then you would go into St. Francis de Sales Church, which was beautiful at the time, filled with flowers, and the smell of the incense, it still comes back to me. And you would walk all around the aisles around the church, and they would be playing Ave Maria. And then there would be a mass, and then this bacchanal of a festival behind the IBS afterward with Italian ice and all kinds of foods and games of chance. It was amazing, and it all ended with fireworks. So that was definitely an institution. The other one would be the West Albany Elementary School. Is now the Hebrew Academy. Most of us are really happy to see that it's still in operation. It closed as West Albany in 1984, right soon after the plant did. Its numbers decreased precipitously after that. Enrollment declined. But it's still used by immigrants, and it's still a place of education. And this was a remarkable thing to the immigrants who came here, that their children could get an education just like rich people, because in Italy, of course, it was only you had to pay for it. So they were unlettered themselves. They thought of that school like a temple. And the teachers were absolutely princes. Anything a teacher said went. All of us have stories about you'd go home and tell your parent about some outrage suffered at the hand of a teacher, and you'd be punished again because the teacher was always right. What did you do that the teacher was mad at you? So Valentino Tabano is a man who spent 28 years as the principal of that school, and he talks about how fabulous it was to have that kind of a parents behind you, which schools now cry out for parental support.
Absolutely.
And he had it because they just couldn't believe it. Yeah. And in fact, I believe that's why West Albany to me is the embodiment of the American dream. That poor people could get a job, that could buy them a house, that could never happen back in the old country, and their children could go to school. So that 3 generations from their coming here, you have their descendants are doctors and lawyers and college professors even.
It's a wonderful thing. Yeah. What was the end to it all?
Colonie died West Albany died in Colonie for a number of reasons, both physical and temporal. Women's lib hurt it. Women are no longer so willing to stay at home. Right. And when you're educated, you're not going to stay at home and accept traditional roles. You're going to want to wander farther in the world. So that hurt. Dutch elm disease killed it. This was a beautiful place with trees on every street and gardens, and they were wiped out by a blight. They built a road, a highway, right through Joe the farmer's fields, the Zaccardo's fields, and that split the community and drained people. Definitely the closing, I think, of Tobin's is what really killed it. All those jobs washed away. Enrollment in the school declined shortly after, and people moved on. They were now living the American dream. We have dispersed.
But their parents could be proud.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. They did it.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for
This was
coming
really
and
fun. Thank
sharing
you.
with us. This is awesome. If you're interested in more historical shows, please contact me at director@colonielibrary.org. Thanks very much.
Thank you.